In the synagogue, in the streets, on the Aeropagus. Kerygma and Dialogue with constant reference to Acts 17. This paper seeks to examine the relationship between Kerygma and Dialogue, arguing that the proclamation of a Christian message can take the form of a dialogical practice, and indeed of an interreligious dialogical practice. By doing so, I hope to address the worries expressed by many, especially, but not exclusively, from within the Christian evangelical Protestant community, that interreligious dialogue often seems to prioritize commitments to peace over commitments to truth. My thesis is that a false dichotomy is often drawn between proclaiming a religious message with strong truth-factual implications, e.g., in the case of a Christian faith, that salvation is to be found only in Jesus, and the mission of interreligious dialogue. This seems to be due to an underlying assumption that dialoguing somehow necessarily requires the weakening of one's religious convictions, insofar as expressing these in their full-blown form would lead necessarily to conflict and/or a shutting down of a conversation. However, I shall argue that this conclusion is not demanded by the nature of dialogue per se, but rather from a particular understanding of what dialoguing means. The latter is underpinned by the assumption that in the realm of religion and spirituality we have no objective access to truth, at least to the extent that no particular religious position can claim to hold a better grasp of the truth with respect to others. As a consequence, under this assumption, all the different parties sitting in dialogue are demanded to relativize their own beliefs as a prerequisite for entering the conversation. This may result in a situation where partakers to the conversation are prevented from honestly expressing their views, something that puts into question the very authenticity of the peace and empathy that interreligious dialogue should promote. I shall then hark back to a different understanding of dialogue, one which is rooted in the Socratic practice of dialoguing as a dialectic exchange between different views concerning the same subject. The aim of such practice is to establish the truth concerning a particular topic through argumentative reasoning. I will apply such a conception of dialogue to interreligious conversation by making reference to the episode of the Apostle Paul preaching the gospel in Athens, as narrated in the 17th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. There, Paul is explicitly said to be dialoguing, original Greek dialegeto, with the Jews and the God-fearing people in the local synagogue, as well as with the philosophers and passers-by in the streets and in the public square. Elaborating this narrative, I shall argue that what emerges is an early instance of a practice of interreligious dialogue based on Socratic assumptions. I shall conclude my presentation arguing that such an approach to interreligious dialogue offers a way for joining kerygmatic enunciation with an empathic approach to dialogue, hopefully making interreligious dialogue more palatable to evangelical Christians. At the same time, I shall argue that such a dialogical model can be fruitfully adopted by faith communities of every sort, as a way of allowing them to join into interfaith communication without having to pay the price of repressing their own beliefs. In terms of my argument, I shall proceed as follows. Firstly, I shall set out a reasoned definition of what I mean with the terms kerygma and dialogue. Secondly, I shall put these terms to use in a brief exegesis of Acts 17, showing how they can be employed to unearth the text's interest with respect to the topic of interreligious dialogue. Thirdly and finally, I will try to discuss what kind of dialogical practice emerges from my exegesis of Acts 17. 1. On kerygma and dialogue. I assume a working definition of kerygma to be fairly mainstream and familiar to those holding a layperson's knowledge of contemporary biblical scholarship. Accordingly, I shall quickly rehearse a few well-known facts concerning this concept. The noun kerygma appears on 3 occasions through the New Testament: in Luke 4:18-19, actually quote taken from Isaiah 61, Romans 10:14, and Matthew 3:1-2, and is related to the Greek verb kerzo, whose meaning is to cry, proclaim. In the context of biblical literature, it is used with a sense of to proclaim, announce, and preach. In his Jesus Christ and Mythology, Rudolf Bultmann claims that, quote, Christian preaching is kerygma, that is, a proclamation addressed not to the theoretical reason, but to the hearer as a self, end quote. Elsewhere, he claims that the kerygma is, quote, the proclamation of a decisive act of God in Christ, end quote. Always according to Bultmann, this proclamation loses its own nature when reduced to a few basic principles. Later on in the same text, Bultmann adds that, quote, kerygma may be regarded as part of the story of man's spiritual evolution and used as the basis for attainable Weltanschauung. Yet, this proclamation claims to be the eschatological word of God, end quote. Given the limited scope of this paper's goals, I shall let aside any discussion of Bultmann's broader theological program. Rather, I want to underline his insistence on the foundational and eventual nature of kerygma. Christian preaching is the enunciation of an act which is directed to the whole self and not to theoretical reason. It cannot be reduced to doctrines, but insofar as it sits at the bottom of a certain worldview, kerygma unfolds in teachings concerning such realms as theology, philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, etc. In this sense, I believe that when Bultmann affirms that kerygma is not directed to theoretical reason, we should rather correct him by holding that kerygma is not addressed to theoretical reason alone. Christian preaching is the kerygma of God's decisive act in Jesus Christ, addressed to the whole self, thus including also theoretical reason. Borrowing on the Dutch Calvinist philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd's words, we can interpret the kerygma as the enunciation of a Christian principle, that is, of the dynamic and spiritual force that permeates, leads, and is propagated in and through the different manifestations of Christianity. To put it differently, we could say that kerygma is the enunciation of God's decisive act in Jesus Christ, that is, the enunciation of Christianity's vital principle, in which all of Christianity is rooted, and out of which Christianity organically grows. This is what Dooyeweerd calls a religious ground motive, that is, quote, a force that acts as a spiritual mainspring in human society, which from the religious center of life governs temporal expressions and points towards the real or supposed origin of all existence, end quote. In Christianity, this ground motive is Jesus, or rather, the triune God living and acting in and through Jesus, witnessed by the first disciples, recorded and articulated in the New Testament canon, and lived and propagated by the following generations of believers. Announcing the kerygma is to further propagate this ground motive and to encourage others to root their lives in it. I shall now turn to introduce the understanding of dialogue which I shall be working with in this paper. Essentially, I aim to structure my concept of dialogue drawing my inspiration from the Socratic and Platonic practice of dialectic. Admittedly, it is not easy to draw from the Platonic dialogues a precise definition of what dialectic is. As one scholar has noted, Plato himself seemed to struggle to provide an answer to the question of just what dialectic means. However, I shall put forward the following definition as a working understanding of Plato's practice of dialectic. Dialectic is a question-answer procedure which can be used for examining the structure of reality. Dialectic divides further into two uses, negative and positive. In its negative use, dialectics is cathartic in that it can clear the way from errors and mistaken views of reality. In its positive use, dialectic is employed as a way to compare different propositions, with the goal of moving from more limited propositions to more general ones. Having concluded our brief exposition of the notions of kerygma and dialogue, let us now see how they intertwine in the scene described in Acts of the Apostles 17. Two. Application to Acts 17. The biblical passage I want to look at stretches from Acts 17:16 to Acts 17:34. which is the famous episode of Paul coming to do missionary work in Athens. This passage contains many elements of great philosophical and theological interests, but I shall focus on the fact that this passage is perhaps the only locus of the New Testament where Paul or any other member of the early church is described as being involved in a debate with members of a different spiritual tradition. In this regard, verses from 16 to 20 are of particular interest, and I shall report them in full. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Aeropagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so I would like to know what it means." End quote. The first thing we should notice is how Luke draws seamlessly together Greek idol worshipping, Greek philosophy, and the Jewish community of Athens. This is not to say that all of a sudden Luke is forgetting all the cultural and religious differences between Greeks and Jews, or for that matter, differences existing internally to the two groups between Jews and non-Jewish God-fearers on the one hand, and philosophers and non-philosophers on the other. Rather, what draws these groups together is Paul's push to announce the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. In other words, what draws together the Athenians in the Lucan narrative is that, no matter their background and opinions, they all need to know about the good news. Under the present terms, we could say that Paul is driven to engage the different segments of Athenian society with kerygmatic intentions. He wants to bring to their awareness the ground motive of the newly born community, and he identifies the Athenians, no matter their differences, as people who live off different non-Christian ground motives. Crucially, the NRSV translation reports at verse 17 the verb to argue, so that what we obtain is that Paul argued with people in the local synagogue, in the marketplace, and later on in verse 22, and onward, in front of Athens' highest court, the Aeropagus. However, I hold that there are good reasons for questioning whether this is the best translation of the verb in question, insofar as the Greek text reports the word dialegeto, for which of course English has an equivalent in the verb to dialogue. What I want to point to is that dialoguing offers a significantly milder nuance than arguing, and having a direct equivalent in the language of destination, it is somewhat puzzling that the NRSV does not choose to use it. One possibility is that the NRSV translators were spurred in this direction by the occurrence of the verb paroxuneto in verse 16, that they translate as deeply distressed, but that F.F. Bruce notices being a very strong word, which could be as well translated with irritated and enraged. In any case, paroxuneto seems to imply a deep feeling of unease which might seem to collide with a mild exchange of opinions. And yet the following verses do not at all give an image of an angry Paul bashing his interlocutors. In turn, the fact that he engages in discussions with passers-by in the marketplace seems almost a reminiscence of Socrates' methodology of engaging random people with philosophical questions. Rather than expressing fury, Luke writes of Paul calmly, if passionately announcing the good news of Jesus and the resurrection, to the point of accepting to be subject to ridicule and insult. Moreover, even though Luke focuses on Paul and only gives scant reports of the reactions of his interlocutors, the whole scene conveys an impression of a thick exchange unfolding in the midst of Athenian business. In other words, Paul's kerygmatic call to convert does not and was not meant to shut down dialogue, but rather to provoke one. In fact, we could say that the moral that we could draw from this passage is that in some contexts, Interreligious dialogue is the best means for expressing one's own religious commitments, even to the point of causing conversion in some of his listeners. At the same time, there is nothing in Luke's narration that seems to prevent a kerygmatic intervention such as Paul's from being truly dialogical, thereby involving honestly, attentively, and respectfully listening to what one's interlocutors have to say. 3. What kind of interreligious dialogue? Having discussed some of the salient features of Acts 17, I shall now use them to sketch out a practice of interreligious dialogue that tries to make room for both kerygmatic frankness and dialogical openness. First of all, let us go back to Doyevant's concept of ground motive. If kerygma is the annunciation of a Christian ground motive, and if kerygma is indeed what Paul is doing in Acts 17, we should conclude that the dialogical practice he carried on in Athens involved announcing and expounding the Christian ground motive. At the same time, we can imagine the Jews, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and everyone else who engaged Paul in that event to be confronting the apostles with their own ideas and spiritual beliefs. In other words, we can imagine them counteracting Paul's ground motive with their own. Borrowing once again from Doyenwerth's conceptual toolkit, we could say that the dialogical scene set up by Paul is conducive to what the Dutch philosopher calls genuine dialogue. As opposed to superficial dialogue, Doyenwerth claims that genuine communication between people animated by different ground motives requires the joint development of all the points of views involved, so that their innermost nature and logic can be unfolded. This makes it possible to understand where the different ground motives meet and where they diverge, thereby making mutual clarification and cooperation possible. Of course, if indeed Paul's exchange with the Athenians can be correctly depicted as a scenario of genuine communication involved in the exposition and comparison of different ground motives, we cannot but conclude that this is indeed an instance of interreligious dialogue. Of course, interreligious is meant here in a broad sense. Paul's Christian gospel is confronted with Jewish biblical monotheism, Stoic pantheism, Epicurean humanism, and the polytheism of Greek popular religion. All of these are different religious options in that they all grow out and propose different ground motives as the mainspring and organizing principles of as many different Weltanschauungen. In conclusion, we could define interreligious dialogue as practiced in Acts 17 as the frank but open and genuine exchange between proponents of different ground motives. Conclusion. Of course, if what I am proposing here is indeed a viable way of doing interreligious dialogue, we should not think that the story of Paul in Athens neither exhausts nor shows all of its possibilities. Rather, what Acts 17 does is presenting us with the main features of this model. In other words, Acts 17 stands just as an instance of a particular form of interreligious dialogue. As a conclusion to this text, I shall close off with 3 remarks concerning the features of a particular model of interreligious dialogue that seems to emerge from the previous discussion. These are the following ones. 1. An unrelativistic approach. By relativism, I intend a particular view of reality that denies the possibility of staking claims to objective truth in a particular domain. Within this context, I am making particular reference to the domain of religious truth, or rather more precisely to the realm of ground motives. The approach to interreligious dialogue that I am putting forward is not relativistic insofar as it does not rest on the belief that a multiplicity of ground motives points to a lack of objectivity in that domain of reality. Rather, it moves from the opposing assumption that, insofar as it is possible in practice to discuss and expose one's own religious motive, we should rather conclude that objectivity is indeed possible in this domain. In other words, if communication between different ground motives is possible, this will suggest that, while each one of them enjoys a degree of relativity with respect to one another insofar as they have different features, they are still comprehended within the same objective order of reality. And this should allow for the fact that some ground motives understands, express, and articulates reality better than others. 2. Suspension of belief is not necessary. Within this scheme, suspension of one's own belief, no matter how exclusivist they may be, it is not a prerequisite for joining in the conversation. In turn, we should say that honest expression of one's own persuasions, even when they might prove offensive to the conversant, is indeed a prerequisite for joining in the conversation. Of course, one first needs to accept joining in the dialogue. A persuasion that rejects any variety of interreligious dialogue or that for whatever reason does not accept to engage with certain kinds of interlocutors would de facto exclude itself from joining in the conversation. At the same time, the unrelativist provision implies that our possibility of frankly exposing our beliefs could be met with scrutiny, attempts of dialectical refutation, and the equally frank expression of views opposing our own, which in some cases could result to be offensive to our sensitivity. 3. The risk of conversion. Finally, I would like to mention how such a model of interreligious dialogue necessarily carries with itself what I would like to call the risk of conversion. One might think that the goal of interreligious dialogue is not that of making converts. Nonetheless, as we have seen in Acts 17, the kerygmatic proclamation, when led in a Socratic and dialogical style, do aim and can result in the conversion of our interlocutors to the effect that they leave behind their former ground motives and adopt our own, or vice versa. In this respect, my argument has been that it is not necessarily the case that there is a contradiction between the proselytizing aims of kerygmatic proclamation and those of interreligious dialogue. That is, a fostering understanding between enliveners of different ground motives. Once again, the possibility of frankly discussing and presenting one's own views must necessarily come with the risk of having one's mind changed by what the interlocutors are presenting. While this might result in a strengthening and or clarification of one's own starting position, and indeed we could make the case that ground motives are specifically able to grow and become more articulate as they meet and clash with other ground motives. On the other hand, the same process could result in somebody having its mind changed, even to the point of changing side by deciding to live according to a different ground motive.